The base was wrapped in the gray stillness of morning as the first light of dawn spread across the horizon. The barracks and hangars stood in neat lines, their metal walls catching faint glimmers of pale gold. The air was cold and dry, filled with the scent of oil and dust and something else. An almost imperceptible weight that seemed to hang over the place like an unspoken memory. General Rourke walked through the corridor, his boots striking the floor with a steady rhythm echoing off the concrete walls. His eyes sharp and restless, scanning every detail as if looking for something he could not name. He had seen battlefields and secret operations and the faces of men who carried truths they would never speak yet. This morning, something in the air felt wrong. The fluorescent lights flickered as he passed through the main hall, the hum of old machinery whispering faintly from behind closed maintenance doors. The general adjusted his collar, his medals clinking softly, though even that small sound felt too loud in the quiet. His thoughts were filled with reports from the night before, security irregularities, missing transmission logs, unexplained camera failures, all dismissed as technical faults. But he had been in the service long enough to know there were no coincidences in places like this. There was always a cause and someone who knew the reason. At the far end of the hall, he saw the elderly janitor, his gray uniform faded and stained from years of work, his shoulders slightly hunched as he moved a mop across the spotless floor. The man looked ordinary, invisible, even like a piece of the building itself. Yet there was something about his stillness, something too controlled, as if he were listening, not cleaning. The general slowed his pace, his instincts tightening like wire. He had met men who could vanish into the background, and most of them were not janitors. Rourke stopped a few feet away, the scent of cleaning solution sharp in the air. The janitor did not look up at first, only continued to move the mop in long, even strokes back and forth, the same pattern without pause. It was only when the general spoke that the man raised his head, his eyes meeting Rourke's in a moment that felt longer than it should have. They were pale blue and calm, yet there was a depth in them that caught Rourke off guard, a stillness that felt like the eye of a storm. The general nodded politely, and the janitor nodded back without a word, then returned to his task. But Rourke did not move. He found himself studying the man's posture, the way his hands gripped the handle of the mop, not with the stiffness of old age, but with precision-controlled strength like someone trained to hold a weapon for long hours. His movements were efficient, almost tactical. The general tried to dismiss the thought as paranoia, but it lingered in his mind. He turned to leave, but hesitated. Glancing back once more, the janitor had stopped mopping and was standing perfectly still, the mop upright in his hand, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something far away, perhaps an echo from memory or something only he could hear. Rourke cleared his throat softly, but the man did not react. Then, after a few seconds, he resumed his work without a word. The moment passed, but the unease did not. Outside the war room, the walls were lined with framed photographs of past missions, old commanders, decorated units, men who had fought and vanished into history. Rourke stopped before one of them, a black and white photo of a squadron taken decades earlier. The faces were young, hard, confident, and he felt a faint pang of nostalgia mixed with regret. As he looked closer, he noticed one of the faces seemed familiar, though he could not place it. He leaned in, squinting at the grainy print, the shape of the jaw, the eyes. Something about that expression. It tugged at his memory. He turned his head slightly and saw the janitor again at the far end of the corridor, pushing his cart quietly toward the maintenance closet. The resemblance hit him suddenly like a flash of light. The face in the photo and the man pushing that cart. They were nearly the same, only separated by time and age. His pulse quickened, but he said nothing. He stood still, watching until the janitor disappeared around the corner. The general walked to the photo again and read the small brass plate beneath it. Squadron 7 Operation. Silent River. Classified the year was nearly 40 years ago, he tried to recall what he knew about that operation. But the name stirred only fragments in his mind, reports that had been sealed, whispers of missions that never officially happened, names erased from databases. Those who returned never spoke of it. Those who did not were forgotten entirely. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He made his way to the command office, his mind still on the janitor and the photo. He sat behind his desk, opening the terminal to review the personnel roster. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, but the janitor did not appear under any current or historical listings, only a maintenance ID number that led nowhere. It was as if the man had been written into the system by a ghost. He leaned back, staring at the screen, the faint hum of the computer filling the silence. His gut told him that the man was no ordinary custodian. Later that morning, he found himself walking past the hangars again, drawn by something he could not explain. He saw the janitor standing outside near the old supply shed, smoking quietly, the smoke curling upward into the cold air. Rourke hesitated before approaching the man, nodded in greeting, and offered the general a cigarette, which he declined. Then the two men stood side by side watching the horizon. The general studied the lines on the man's face, the scars faint, but there, deep along the temple and neck marks that looked more like shrapnel than age. "You've been here long?" the general asked, his voice casual, but the janitor only smiled faintly and said, "Long enough, sir." His tone was steady, unbothered, but the words carried weight, the kind that hides stories best left buried. Rourke felt the need to press, but something in the man's eyes stopped. He had seen that look before in soldiers who had seen too much done too much and survived when others had not the kind of survival that left ghosts in the blood. The siren from the control tower broke the silence, a distant mechanical wail that faded as quickly as it began. Routine test, nothing more, but both men had turned instinctively toward the sound in perfect unison, like soldiers trained under the same command. Rourke noticed it, the reflex, precise, unthinking, too exact to belong to, a man who cleaned floors for a living. His suspicion grew colder, steadier, like a fog settling in his mind. That night, as the base slept, Rourke stayed in his office reading through old files, cross-checking names and photos from declassified missions. The face appeared again and again, sometimes blurred, sometimes half-hidden, but always there, a pilot code name. Viper 1 listed as missing, presumed dead after an operation gone wrong over hostile territory. Decades earlier, the report ended abruptly. All records sealed under highest clearance. He sat back, staring at the name, feeling the faint tremor of revelation, but refusing to believe it. Morning came gray and heavy. The janitor was already working when Rourke entered the corridor again, his hands steady as ever. The general paused, his boots silent. This time the old man turned, and for a moment neither spoke. The hum of the lights filled the space between them. Then the janitor said quietly, "You should get some rest, sir. Long nights do strange things to the mind." Rourke wanted to ask, "Who are you, really?" But something in the man's tone made the question die in his throat. The mop glided across the floor, smooth and deliberate, leaving faint streaks that caught the light like scars. The general's reflection appeared beside the man's in the polished surface, two figures, one of authority, one of service, yet something bound them, an invisible thread woven from history and silence. Rourke stepped closer, his voice low, almost uncertain. "Have we met before?" The janitor looked up, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Maybe once, sir, a long time ago." Before the general could speak further, an officer called from the end of the hall, summoning him to the briefing room. Rourke gave a brief nod and turned away. But as he did, he caught a final glimpse of the janitor standing still watching him with that same unreadable calm. And in that gaze, he saw something unsettling: recognition, not of rank or duty, but of memory shared across time and war, a silent acknowledgement of something buried deep beneath the polished floors and classified files. When Rourke reached the war room door, he hesitated once more. The thought gnawed at him relentless. Who was this man, and why did his presence feel like a shadow from the past? He promised himself he would find out, but deep inside he already knew the answer, lingered just beyond the edge of his thoughts, waiting to be spoken. Outside, the first light of day broke fully through the clouds, casting long streaks of gold across the base. The world moved on the hum of engines, the calls of soldiers, the clatter of boots, yet beneath it all, beneath the noise and order, something old and unfinished stirred quietly, waiting for the moment it would be remembered again. The morning sun had risen higher, casting bright light through the narrow windows of the war room. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the low murmur of officers exchanging reports. General Rourke stood at the head of the long steel table, his gaze fixed on the holographic display, glowing faintly with red lines and shifting coordinates around him. Younger men spoke in clipped voices about security updates and new patrol schedules, yet his mind wandered back to the janitor. The image of the man standing in that silent hallway, refusing to fade from thought. Every instinct he possessed screamed that there was something more to the old man, something that connected him to a truth. The general had almost forgotten one that the military had buried deep beneath layers of clearance and silence. He listened half-heartedly to the reports, nodding occasionally, but his thoughts remained elsewhere, like a shadow trailing just out of reach. The janitor appeared again that morning, standing quietly by the far door of the room, mop in hand, his uniform. The same faded gray, the officers paid him no attention, as if he were invisible, as if his existence had been accepted without question. Rourke looked toward him. Their eyes met briefly, and in that single glance something passed between them, unspoken, a quiet recognition. The janitor gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning away to resume his work. As the meeting continued, a young officer named Carter cracked a joke about the age of the base and the ghosts that supposedly haunted its halls. Laughter rippled through the room, light and careless. But Rourke noticed the janitor had stopped moving his hands, resting motionless. On the mop handle, his head bowed slightly. The laughter died when the general spoke, his tone calm, yet sharp enough to cut through the air. "Let us focus, gentlemen. Ghosts belong to the past, and the past has its reasons for staying buried." The room fell silent, the hum of the ventilation. The only sound, Carter cleared his throat awkwardly, then looked toward the janitor, who still had not moved, and with a nervous smile he said, "Hey, old-timer, you ever see any ghosts around here?" The janitor raised his head slowly, his eyes clear and steady as he looked straight at the young man, then at the general, before saying quietly and evenly, "No ghosts, sir. Only survivors." The words hung heavy in the air, the kind of sentence that did not belong to small talk. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Some forced a laugh. Others turned back to their papers, but General Rourke felt the tension behind those words like a blade hidden in the dark. He took a step forward, studying the janitor closely. The man looked unchanged, expressionless, calm, but his eyes, those eyes carried history. Rourke spoke, his tone measured. "What did you do before working here?" The janitor paused for a heartbeat, then answered, "Cleaning up after the mess, sir." The general frowned. Something in the phrasing twisted inside his mind. It sounded too practiced, too deliberate. He moved closer, the air between them charged with quiet challenge. He asked again, this time with a trace of authority, "I mean before this base." The janitor looked at him for a long moment, the hum of the monitors filling the silence around them. Then his voice came low, "And even before this base, I was where I needed to be, sir. Where orders were given and followed nothing more." His words were careful, precise, the tone of a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding saying too much. Rourke felt the chill creep up his spine. This was no ordinary custodian, no aging worker clinging to routine. This was a man trained to vanish, one of the officers whispered. to another asking under his breath if the general was interrogating the janitor. The sound of it made Rourke turn sharply his gaze. Silencing the room, he looked back at the old man, who now seemed to stand taller, straighter, the years falling away. Like dust from an old uniform, Rourke said quietly, "Your call sign, soldier." The janitor blinked once, slowly, his hand tightening slightly around the mop handle. He seemed to weigh the question in his mind. Then he spoke two words that froze the room. Viper. One. Every conversation stopped. The hum of the machines seemed to fade away. Even the lights felt dimmer, as if the air itself had thickened. The general stared, unable to breathe for a moment. Viper 1. The name whispered through his memory like a ghost, from the files, from the reports, from the legends. It was the name of a pilot from Operation Silent River, the one who had gone missing, the one who had been presumed dead, the one whose disappearance had been sealed by command, the man who should not have been standing there now. The officers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the general and the janitor, who stood unmoving, unflinching, his voice calm as he continued. "You should not speak that name, sir. Not in this room, not in front of them." Rourke felt the old instinct rising inside him, the sense of danger of classified truths pressing at the edges of the present. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low, almost a whisper. "Who are you really?" The janitor looked down, at the mop, then back at Rourke, his eyes carrying something deep and wounded, a lifetime buried in secrecy. He said quietly, "I was a name. Once, I was a mission. I was erased when the war forgot itself." His voice cracked faintly at the edge of those words, but his expression never changed. Calm, resolute. He looked at the other officers, then back to Rourke again. "The past does not rest, sir. It waits for its orders to end." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the general said, dismissing the others. Everyone out the officers hesitated, but the tone in his voice allowed no question. The door closed behind them, leaving only Rourke and the janitor in the silent war room. The old man set the mop aside and straightened his back fully for the first time, his bearing unmistakably military, the calm precision of a soldier who had once stood in the sky above enemy lines. Rourke said, "You died 40 years ago. The report said." The janitor gave a small nod. "Perhaps I was supposed to? Sir, perhaps I should." Have his gaze distant, as if seeing through time. Perhaps we all did. The mission was never meant to be known, and those who knew it were meant to disappear. The general felt his throat tighten, the pieces falling into place, the missing records, the classified seals, the face in the photograph. "Why are you here?" Rourke asked quietly. The janitor smiled faintly, not with joy but with the kind of sorrow that comes from remembering. "I came back to finish what was left undone, sir. There are still orders. Out there, ghosts that think they are alive, files that still breathe in the dark, and you are standing too close to them." The lights flickered again, a faint buzz in the ceiling, the hum of the bass steady outside, yet the room felt detached from the world beyond. Rourke took a step back, his mind racing, but the janitor only watched him, waiting calm and silent, like he had been waiting a long time. He spoke once more, barely above a whisper. "Do not look for me after today, sir. What comes next is not written yet." Then he turned and walked toward the door, his movements steady, sure, the mop left behind on the floor like a relic of disguise. Rourke stood still, unable to move as the door closed, the name Viper, one echoing in his mind like a pulse from another lifetime. The war room was silent long after the door closed. General Rourke stood alone, his reflection caught in the dark glass of the screen before him, the name Viper 1 echoing in his thoughts again and again like a voice from a dream. He could not escape outside the hum of the bass carried on the sounds of engines starting, soldiers moving, orders shouted through radios, but none of it reached him fully. His mind was somewhere else, lost in the corridors of the past. He sat, down at the edge of the table, his hands clasped tightly. His eyes fixed on the faint trail of wet footprints the janitor had left behind. They led to the door, then vanished into nothing like the memory of a life erased. He leaned forward, pressing, his palms against the cold steel surface of the table, breathing slow and heavy. He had seen men die, vanish, disappear under orders he himself had signed, papers that buried missions and silenced names. But this was different. This was a ghost that had walked back into the light. The terminal screen flickered faintly, and without thinking, he began searching again, typing in the name Viper 1 into the classified archive. It should have denied access, but instead, lines of old code appeared one after another, the screen filling with static and half-corrupted text. He leaned closer, reading what fragments he could mission. Coordinates, names, dates all blurred, but one line stood out clearly. Mission. Objective incomplete. He stared at it for a long moment, then whispered to the empty room. "What did you leave unfinished?" Outside the window, the sky had turned darker, clouds moving in from the east carrying the promise of a storm. Rourke rose from his seat and left the room, moving down the long hallway, the same one where he had first seen the janitor. Everything felt different. Now the silence was heavier. The walls seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering the sound of old voices. He passed the maintenance closet. But the cart was gone. The mop was gone. Only a faint smell of cleaning solvent remained sharp and ghost-like. He turned the corner and saw movement at the far end of the corridor, the janitor or the man who had once been Viper. One standing before a metal door marked Restricted Access. The general's pulse quickened. He moved quietly. His boots barely making a sound as he approached the man, did not turn but seemed to know he was there. The general stopped a few feet away, his voice low. "What is in there?" The janitor did not answer for a moment, then said softly, "What we tried to destroy, sir. What refused to die." He entered a code into the keypad. The lock clicked open, and the heavy door slid aside. The air that came out was cold and metallic, tinged with oil and age. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with old consoles covered in dust and stacks of yellowed documents long forgotten beneath newer layers of secrecy. Rourke followed slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Everything felt wrong, like stepping into a memory. That should not exist. The janitor walked to a steel cabinet and opened it, revealing files marked with red ink. Operation Silent River. Rourke's breath caught in his throat. He had read about this operation only in fragments, but seeing the files in front of him made it real. The janitor pulled out one folder and placed it on the table. His hands steady, he looked at Rourke and said, "We were told to erase it, sir, to make sure no trace remained, but not all of it."